pulled her off the respirator and the heart machine. I think they kept the feeding tubes in. And believe it or not, she actually survived. She was in a coma until 92, like a long time, until, or 85. She died of pneumonia. But it was kind of that was kind of the test case where Christians came up with this concept of, okay, what do we do in this situation? Because these machines weren't in the Bible. And we need to also embrace other verses in the Bible, like Ecclesiastes 3:12, that say there's a time to be born and a time to die. Is it right to use technology to extend a person's life indefinitely when death is so imminent otherwise? Even Genesis 3:19 says, eventually we all need to return to dust. So how do we respect death in this whole thing? And what Christians have kind of come up with is, this is like a really dumbest version of it, this summary. When death is inevitable and imminent, by turning off the heart machine and the ventilator, but not the feeding tubes, we give God the final decision. Because when we take out the feeding tubes, that's actively terminating their life. You're taking an active role. But when you just take off the heart machine and the respirator, it's very passive, and God still has room to be God, and He can still make the final decision because they're still getting food and water. The way the Catholics have written it is Pope John Paul II in 2004, he stated that healthcare providers are morally bound to provide food and water to patients in persistent vegetative states. That's the state that Terry Scheibel was in. But implication, they're not morally bound to keep the ventilators and the heart machines on. And they have a much longer statement. Basically what Christians have kind of come up with over the last 35 years is, okay, if death is so imminent and so inevitable, heart machine and ventilators, it's okay to turn that off because that gives God room to do what He needs to do, but not the feeding tubes. Not ever the feeding tubes. The only parallel I could find in Scripture was back to the Jonah story. And if you remember when God told him to go to Nineveh, He said, not on your life. You're supposed to go 500 kilometers this way. Instead, he went 2,500 kilometers in the opposite direction. And he went on the most dangerous transportation available at the time. He went on a boat. So he's got a death wish, Jonah does. So he goes on the boat, falls asleep in the bottom. God sends a storm to get his attention, give him a second chance. The sailors wake him up and they say, Jonah, Jonah, we know you're running from God. What can you do about this? He goes, you got to kill me. Throw me in the water, let me drown. And they say, no, we can't do that. We refuse to do that because we believe that the sanctity of life trumps the quality of life. So we're going to suffer. We're going to go through this with you. And so they row and they lose a lot of money throwing stuff overboard. The storm gets worse and worse, and finally they say to God, they start praying to Jonah's God. They say, God, we're turning off the ventilator and the heart machine. We're throwing him into the ocean. It's up to you. Not what they said. But basically what they're saying is, we're not going to kill him, but we'll throw him in the ocean and let you decide, God. And God decides by sending this giant whale or fish, swallow him, basically saving him from drowning, and spitting him out 3 days later on the shores of Nineveh to get his second chance at his calling. That's the closest I could find to this situation, was that these sailors said, okay, death is inevitable for all of us, and it's imminent. We'll let God decide. We'll throw him in the water. Maybe he'll survive, maybe he won't. And God did decide. I want to end with two things. First, I want to read something that a disabled person wrote in regards to this issue. Then I'm going to tell you the story about Haley Kuchar. Here's what the disabled fellow wrote in response to the Terry Scheibel and the Haley Kuchar stories. Here's what he says. There's been millions of disabled people with misery in their life. Many live alone, many live unloved, and sometimes in pain. Sadly, that has been a reality for disabled people throughout history. But being miserable is not a reason to kill disabled people, he writes. If misery were a reason for death, none of us with disabilities would be safe. It would be open season on the disabled. The answer is not to kill us as a flimsy excuse of stopping misery or bestowing so-called death with dignity. The answer lies elsewhere. It lies in proper pain management and seeking life with dignity and inclusion. It means including them in the life of society, especially for those that do not currently have inclusion. This part I'm going to tell you the story of Haley Poutre. 3 years ago, 11-year-old Haley was hospitalized after her stepfather allegedly, because this is still in court, burned her and beat her nearly to death with a baseball bat. She had been taken from her mother, single mom, and put in with her aunt and her boyfriend, the stepdad, Jason Strickland. But she was severely abused in her adoptive family's home. So she's taken to the hospital, and she was kept alive in a coma by a feeding tube and a ventilator. Doctors say she was virtually brain dead in a persistent vegetative state. That's the term they coined for people like Haley and Terry Scheibel. With no hope of recovery, the doctors say. Social services wanted to remove her feeding tubes and her breathing tubes. As they said, her condition was hopeless and irreversible. So very similar to Terry Scheibel. In fact, they argued that Haley Poutre was actually worse than Terry Scheibel. She was in a coma, and she's 11-year-old, hopeless, irreversible. So the Ministry of Social Services, or the District of Social Services, this is in Massachusetts, Springfield, Massachusetts, takes their case to the Supreme Court to argue that just like Terry Scheibel, we need to pull the feeding tubes out from Haley's stomach and the ventilator. And the courts agreed with social services. You know, the precedent had been set with the Terry Scheibel case. The amazing thing happened was, the day before they removed, so they had total permission to end this girl's life. As they moved in to pull the plug, the day before, she started breathing on her own. And within time, within months and a year, she started writing her name, combing her hair. You can see videos on YouTube of her feeding herself. Who's the brain dead in this story? Haley Poutre? No. It's these people that believe that quality of life trumps the sanctity of life, and they're more than willing, the courts and the doctors, to end her life by pulling on not just the ventilator, but the feeding tubes. Some say, what a miracle of God, but I say, you know, that's humanity. God's made us like that we can recover. Just give us time. You know, it's just been a few weeks, a few days, and they're like, oh, quality of life is bad. Pull the plug on her. It's irreversible. My God, it's not right. So Haley Poutre recovers, and now she's even beginning to communicate about the abuse she went through at the home of her stepfather, Jason Strickland. Amazing story, which just kind of proves that life and death issues are not ours to make. That's God's arena. And it shouldn't have even been a question. They should have just continued the feeding tubes into Haley Poutre's body for as long as it takes, and maybe take her off ventilator eventually as she learns to breathe on her own. Maybe she'll come out of the coma like many people do years later. But it's like there's this, I don't know what their motivation is. Saving money, the doctors or the hospital, or trying to make a point, or some other sinister plan, because we know there's a sinister plan in our society. Jesus is not in charge of our culture, the other team is. Who knows why? But I think we need to be informed, and we need to have a strong opinion on this, that the sanctity of life always trumps any questions about quality of life. Christians are called to actively ease, not actively end the suffering of others. And when death is inevitable and imminent, it's okay to turn off the heart machine and the ventilator, but not the feeding tubes. That gives God a chance to do His thing. And if this kind of gets you and it lands in a place of fertile soil with you, I would encourage you to go to the church's website and go to the volunteer tab, and you can find a volunteer opportunity to volunteer with people who are brain damaged and disabled and terminally ill, and the elderly. There's like thousands of opportunities for us to volunteer once a week, once a month, an hour here, an hour there, with this group of people. And you will discover through hands-on, through personality, through the time together, that there is indeed a quality of life there with these people, and there is by far obvious a sanctity of life. And I think we can put kind of some hands-on to our head-on.